You're at the best part of the book. Um, their papa just rolled up, Paul Edward, Big Ma's husband, if we're thinking about Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and their grandfather, who we hadn't, who we haven't met because he had passed away. So I thought that was kind of cool, and just getting the background of his life and his connection to this um, the Simses as well. So let's see. They were just rescuing Joe from the humiliation that Ed Rose um, and Charlie Sims were trying to do, and they were just finishing up at church. On our way home, Papa took a side road to the Reverend's house. It was late. The house was dark, but Papa woke the Reverend up anyway and told him about Joe and the Simses. The Reverend and Papa, they agreed that the meeting the Simses had told Joe about was canceled. They agreed that's what they would sell Joe. That next morning it was Papa, not Mama, who took us in the wagon to the Simses. Old man McAllister Sims saw Papa and ain't said a word. Papa ain't said a word either. You boys mind yourselves, Papa said to us. I'll be back come sunset. Then he turned the wagon around and headed back to our land. And that's the way it was for the months we worked at Sims's place. Every day Papa took us over there. Every day Papa came at sunset and took us home. We put in our months, and Papa and Kevin and Mitchell stayed at home and saw us through it. But we all knew that one day they'd have to go back to lumbering again, and that's just what they did. When all working days at the Simses ended, when we were finally free to spend our days on our own land, Papa, my brothers Mitchell and Kevin, they all headed back to the Natchez Trace. 1 week after they were gone, Hammer made it a point of going back to the Simses farm, found Charlie alone, and knocked him down again. I was with him and not wanting to be. Now tell that to your daddy, he said. Tell him Hammer Logan done knocked you down again. Tell him I used my fist, nothing else. Tell him that, and even if he do come after me, see if you don't get your own self whipped this time. He said that and left Charlie sitting on the ground staring after him. Charlie didn't move to get up, but he cursed Hammer. Y'all gonna pay! He called after us. Y'all gonna sure enough pay for this. I knew it wasn't over. I braced myself and waited for the sheriff or old man McAllister to come calling, this time with a rope. But the days and nights passed and nobody came except folks wanting more water. After a while, I began to think maybe nobody was coming, that maybe Charlie had decided it was best to keep what Hammer had done to himself. 2 or 3 days after I came to that way of thinking, Mr. Melbourne and George came knocking on the door. The dawn had just broke, and Halton had already gone off to the fields. Ma Rachel was gone, too. She'd spent the night at Aunt Callie's. Come to get some more water, that be all right with y'all, said Mr. Melbourne. Mama stood in the doorway and talked to him. Help yourself. You know you're always welcome to it. Well, I'm right obliged, Mr. Melbourne said. Thought we would have done had more rain by now, and we wouldn't have to be troubling you. Ain't no trouble, said Mama. No trouble at all. Well, I thank you. We ain't had much of a garden, but my missus done sent you some pickled onions and tomatoes and such, just to show our appreciation. Got 'em in my wagon. Well, you know that ain't necessary, Mr. Melbourne, but I sure do thank you. Thank your wife for me, too. David, you go in the wagon and get them preserves, and Hammer, you give Mr. Melbourne a hand with the water. Hammer and me, we did as we was told and walked out with the Melbournes. Together, Hammer and George Melbourne lifted one of the empty barrels from the wagon, and Mr. Melbourne took down the other. Mr. Melbourne pointed to the basket his wife had sent, then he headed for the well, just as 2 more wagons pulled up the drive. Mr. Jonas Peabody from up the road and 3 of his red-headed boys were on the first wagon. Mr. Tom B. and John Henry Barry beside him on the other. Mr. Melbourne set his barrel down beside the well and gave a wave. Looked like I done beat y'all to this sweet water this morning. Mr. Peabody laughed and got down, followed by his boys. Well, just don't get it all. We got us a mighty thirst. The Peabodys went over and stood by the well. Mr. Tom B. got down along with John Henry, and the two of them gave the Peabodys and the Melbournes a polite nod, then grinned at Hammer and me. "How y'all boys doing?" asked Mr. Tom B. "And how's the rest of the family?" "Fine," we said. "Good. Think I'll go on in and speak while I waits my turn." Mr. Tom B. started across the lawn. I followed after him, carrying the basket of pickled onions and tomatoes and such. John Henry stayed with Hammer. Hammer lifted the top of the well. I stopped and turned. So did Mr. Tom B. "Lord have mercy!" exclaimed Mr. Melbourne, and he stepped back from the well. Everybody standing there did the same. All hands went to their faces. "What in God's name is that stench?" cried Mr. Melbourne. I set the basket, hurried over. Mr. Tom B. followed. "Mama!" called Hammer, stepping back to the well. "Mama!" Mama immediately appeared in the doorway. "What is it? What's that I smell?" "It's the well, Mama," I yelled to her. "It's the well." Mama left the doorway and ran down to the well. She peered down into the blackness of it. Then she unhooked the bucket from its post and lowered it down into the well. "Here, Miss Caroline, let me do that," said Mr. Tom B. Mama shook her head, not even turning to him. Her eyes were on the blackness of the well. We all heard the bucket drop. We all heard the bucket fill. Then Mama pulled on the rope and began to haul water. Hammer went over to her. "Let me, Mama," he said. But again she shook her head, almost as if she didn't hear. Hand over fist, she drew the water up. The stench became almost unbearable. The bucket was up. Mama wrapped the rope back to its pole and peered into the water. Then she shook her head. Strands of long hair lay on the top of the bloody water. "Something is dead down there," she said in a voice unbelieving. "Some animal done fell in trying to get to the water." She shook her head again and moaned, "Oh, Lord!" "Charlie!" Everyone's eyes settled on Hammer. "Charlie Sims, son of a Hammer!" cried Mama, not stupefied enough to let Hammer swear. "No animal just fell down there, Mama. The top was up," Hammer said, "but some animal I know done put something foul down in there." "Boy, do you know what you're saying?" demanded Mr. Peabody. Mr. Tom B. stepped forward. "Now, Hammer, wait." "Yeah, I know." There was only silence, a dead silence. Mama stepped back from the well. "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." "Lord ain't had nothing to do with this," exclaimed Hammer. "It was them Simses. David knows it. They ain't never liked the fact that we had water on our land, and they ain't. And they had to come up here and get water. Charlie and Ed Rosemuch has told David and me they'd come up here and poison this well one day. They said at the time we were all down at the creek watering the cows. Another time, too, said maybe one day we'd find something dead down our well. Ain't that right, David? Ain't that what they said?" John Henry had heard the same, but Hammer didn't put his name in it, and I think John Henry was just as glad he didn't. I looked around the circle at folks, at Hammer, and nodded. "It's the truth, all right." Mr. Peabody stepped forward. "Y'all know what y'all saying? Y'all making some serious charges here." "We know what we know," said Hammer. I nodded again. "It's the truth." "'Sides that," said Hammer, and looked straight at George Melbourne, "we ain't the only ones heard them say it." John Henry looked a bit uneasy, but Hammer didn't even glance his way. "Who else, then?" asked Mr. Melbourne. "Ask your son," said Hammer. Mr. Melbourne, looking kind of puzzled now, turned to George. "Do you know something about this?" George looked at Hammer and me, then back at his daddy. "No, sir. I was down by the creek one day. They was there, and Charlie and Ed Rose and Dewberry was there too, but I ain't heard nothing. I can't say they done said it." Mr. Peabody shook his head. "Well, I can't believe it. I can't believe nobody would be that down low." "Low down? Mr. Melbourne looked at Mama and Hammer and me. Then he said, "One way to find out. We can ask them." Mr. Peabody looked doubtful. Mr. Tom B. was silent, letting the white men do the talking, but he looked doubtful too. "I'll go myself," said Mr. Melbourne. "I'll talk to both them boys and old man McAllister." "Don't think that's going to be necessary," said Mr. Peabody as another wagon came up the road. "Look yonder." We all looked. Old man McAllister Sims, Ed Rose, and Charlie were in the wagon, headed for our drive, and all of us knew it without a word being spoken. 2 water barrels sat in the back of the wagon. There was only silence as the wagon turned up our drive. There was only silence as the wagon came to a halt behind Tom B.'s wagon. There was only silence as old man McAllister Sims gave a nod in greeting, and he and Ed Rose and Charlie got down. They came over to the well. "My Lord, what's that smell?" asked Mr. Sims. "Ask your boys," said Hammer, much too quickly for a little Negro boy standing there dealing with white men. "They the ones that put the stink in there." "What you talking about, N-word?" cried Charlie. Old man McAllister's lined and weathered face looked to line and weather some more. "Gal," he said, staring at Mama, "you best hush up that little N-word of yours before I have to come over there and hush him up for you." Mama cast a look on Hammer, warning him not to speak another word. Then she stepped right side of him, took hold of him, and her tall frame suddenly seemed taller. "Somebody done put something rotten and dead down our well, Mr. Sims. My boys believe your boy's the one done it. They believes that, and I gots to know. Them boys of yourn, them boys, Charlie and Ed Rose, would they go and do something like that to this sweet water? Would they?" Old man McAllister's eyes turned to slits. His breathing grew heavy. He took a step forward. "I'll cut out your heart for what you're saying, gal." "You try," said Hammer, and pulled from Mama's grip. "You try, and I'll see you dead." His words were quietly spoken, and they were chilling, even to me. Old man McAllister Sims came no further. "Look here, Mr. Sims," said Mr. Melbourne, before old man McAllister took it upon himself to knock Hammer down for what he said. "We don't want things getting out of hand here, but the truth of the matter is, this sweet water well has been poisoned. Now, you know as well as I do what that means to everybody who's been using this well. Now, I know for a fact my brother and his boys was up here last evening yesterday, and they drawn up good water. I come up first thing this morning to get my family some water, and this well here's stinking like hell. Now, them boys yonder, that Hammer and that David, they done said your boys, Charlie and Ed Rose there, they done threatened to poison this here well. Now, I wants to know what's the truth of it." Mr. Sims cursed and spat on the ground. Mr. Melbourne put up his hand as if to stop any more such action or anything worse. "Now, I ain't saying I'm taking these boys' words on what happened. All I know is the well here done saved me and mine for many months now, and these folks here, they ain't had to share, but they done it without asking nothing from nobody. Now, all of a sudden, they water ain't no good no more, and I gotta ask why. I gotta ask why." "Maybe they done put something down in there theyselves," said Ed Rose before his father could speak. "Put it down there, and now they trying to blame it on us." "Now, why would we go and do a fool thing like that?" asked Hammer. "Hush," said Mama, but too late. The words were already spoken, and Charlie took them up. "'Cause you figuring you and David could get Ed Rose and me back for all that work y'all had to do after jumping on me. You're figuring to lay the blame of a bad well on Ed Rose and me to get everybody all riled against us. Well, it ain't gonna work, you little M-words. Ain't nobody gonna believe your word over a white man's." "I suppose not," said Hammer, and looked at George Melbourne. George Melbourne's reddened and kept his silence. John Henry and me, our eyes met. It was just then that Joe McAllister came walking up the road. "Morning," he said before he'd even gotten up the drive. Nobody said a word, but things like that didn't bother Joe. I doubt if he even noticed, because he turned his attention to the next thing in his mind. Mr. Charlie! Mr. Ed Rose! How'd that hunt come out the other night? Bet them possums and them coons y'all done bagged was mighty good eatin'. Old man McAllister Sims turned cold eyes on his boys. Y'all gone hunting? Ed Rose and Charlie looked at each other, and all of us standing there could see their fear. No, sir, Pa, Ed Rose yelped out. We ain't. Yeah, you did, said Joe, just as friendly as always. He had no idea what was going on. You done forgot, huh? I see ya. When y'all gone? Demanded old man McAllister Sims. Y'all ain't brought no hunt home for your mama to cook in a spell now. Aw, Pa. You know Joe, said Charlie. You know he ain't right in the head. He making it up. I ain't, Joe cried, getting a bit vexed about anybody doubting his word. I done see y'all down along the Rosalie just the night before last, and I said, hey there, Mr. Charlie, Mr. Ed Rose, y'all had done already bagged yourselves a possum and a coon too, and I done asked you what you was going to do with that skunk y'all done caught, and y'all done said it was for a joke and not to tell nobody. Don't y'all remember? Charlie took a step backwards. Oh, Daddy, Joe just mad because we've been making fun of him. We done played a trick on him a while back. He just mad, Daddy. He lying. Nah, he ain't, said Mr. McAllister Sims. He ain't got the brains to lie. Well, then he's just done mixed up the days. That's right, Pa, said Ed Rose. He just done got the days mixed up. He must be talking about that last coon hunt we gone on. Yeah, that's right, Pa. That's right. That was more than a month ago. Old man McAllister stared dead-eyed at those boys of his, and he shook his head. That ain't what happened. Y'all boys are lying to me. No, Pa, we ain't. Y'all done poisoned that well. Aw, nah. Y'all done shamed me and mine. No, sir, Pa, cried Charlie. No, sir, we ain't done no such thing. No, sir. Don't you go lying to me, boy, said Mr. McAllister Sims, and with one mighty fist knocked Charlie to the ground. It's one thing to teach an N-word where he stand, but you don't go destroying God's good earth to do it. He reached inside his wagon and pulled out a bullwhip. Charlie's eyes and Ed Rose's too got bigger. No, Pa! Yelled Ed Rose, backing away. Pa, don't you do it! Cried Charlie. Don't shame us like this in front of N-words. Y'all done already. Shamed yourselves, shouted the old man. Get up! Please, Pa, please, cried Charlie again as he got up. Not in front of N-words. Old man McAllister Sims stood there breathing hard and trembling with rage. Then he stepped back. Charlie, you and Ed Rose get down in that well and get them dead things out of there. But, Pa, Mr. McAllister Sims cracked the whip upon the ground. Don't y'all back talk me. There was only white men standing up here. Y'all wouldn't be talking at all now. Y'all done put the filth down there. Y'all get it out and don't stop till it's all out. Y'all hear me? Not till it's all out. Charlie, you the one get down there first. Ed Rose and Charlie backed away from their daddy, looked at the Peabodys and the Melbournes, but not at Mr. Tom B., John Henry, Hammer, Mama, or me. I reckon they were too ashamed to look at us. They got a rope from the wagon, and Ed Rose lowered Charlie down into the well. It took 'em a while, and we all waited. Charlie came up wet and shivering without a thing, and Mr. McAllister Sims sent Ed Rose down. We waited some more. Back and forth the brothers went, taking turns going down. They brought up parts of a possum, a coon, and a skunk, too, and went back down. Seeing those parts, all of us standing there knew Ed Rose and Charlie hadn't taken any chances about spoiling all well. They hadn't just thrown dead animals down in there at night. they'd hacked him up before they did. I can't imagine what kind of the fact that they killed the animals and cut them up, and it's just like evil, awful. Ugh. The time passed, and more folks, colored folks and white folks, their wagons filled with empty barrels, came up the road. And there was a buzz of words softly passed about what the Sims had done, and a silence settled over the wagons and the day. Finally, it was Charlie who brought the last of the dead things out. "Y'all got it all?" Old man McAllister demanded of Charlie. Charlie, eyes lowered, nodded. "All we can, Daddy." "And y'all get on in that wagon. In the back!" Charlie placed the last dead thing in the back of their wagon, and he and Ed Rose got in with them. Mr. McAllister Sims climbed on the seat, took up the reins, and turned the mules down the drive. As the Simses passed, all those wagons lined up for water, and all those silent, accusing eyes. Charlie and Ed Rose hung their heads. Old man McAllister, though, stared dead-eyed, straight ahead. Folks watched the wagon until it was gone out of sight. Then the folks began to leave. Mr. Melbourne and George left, and the Peabodys, too. All the folks left, all with empty barrels. The possum and the coon and the skunk, most parts of them anyway, were out of the well, but the water was spoiled just the same. All the good well water was gone now, and everybody suffered because of what Charlie and Ed Rose had done. Eventually, though, the well was drained, the earth cleared itself out, and the water was good again. In a few years, another dry spell came, and again, everybody's well went dry. Everybody's, except ours. Folks came again to draw the water, and Mama and Papa shared it as freely as before. Colored folks and white folks, too, came for that sweet water. Everybody came. Everybody except the Simses. As long as old man McAllister Sims lived, we never saw any of the Simses step foot on our land again. I wonder if we'll see them step foot on their land and Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. So that is the story of Charlie Sims and the Logans. So David Logan, that just kind of shows you a little bit of a background there before we go back to reading Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. So that was the resolution. And I'll stop here.